Donald J. Trump will put his hand on his childhood Bible and take the weighty oath of office, becoming 45th President of the United States of America. Guests are already gathering up on the west front of the U.S. Capitol. You see President Clinton and Hillary Clinton there. Other former presidents are there, along with Supreme Court justices, members of Congress, members of Donald Trump's family. They've already been put into place. President-elect Trump and President Obama are headed up to Capitol Hill now. They had coffee at the White House earlier this morning. There you see Bush 43 and his wife, Laura Bush, amongst those in attendance today. Shortly, we'll see the announcement of Melania Trump, the soon-to-be First Lady. Karen Pence, the Vice President-to-be's wife, will come and join the gathering of American political leaders from both parties on what will be an extraordinary day of both ceremony and an important transition, unlike the country has ever seen. John Heilman, you saw Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton there today. The expectation of many was that she would be taking the oath of office today, and instead, in one of the biggest surprises and maybe the biggest political upset the country's ever seen, Donald Trump will become President of the United States in about an hour.
It is an extraordinary thing, and I think it is the greatest political upset of all time. I think that this transition is, in many ways, one of the most surreal, certainly the most surreal inauguration of our lifetimes. It's hard to imagine what the Clintons are feeling at this point, given the level of expectation that she had, along with much of the country, Republican and Democrat alike, that she would be the person taking the oath today. There was a lot of speculation about whether they would attend. She has been, according to many of her friends, in a very dark and depressed place for the last couple of months, and I think it exhibits extraordinary fortitude on her part and a great commitment to the goal of trying to unify the country, that both of them will be here today and putting on, I'm sure, a brave face against still a great deal of emotional and psychological pain.
It's one of the dramas we'll be following today. Of course, Hillary Clinton is there not because she's the one who lost the general election. She's there as the spouse of a former president, as a former first lady. And so she has as good a seat as anyone will have, and just, again, in under an hour to watching Donald Trump take the oath of office. This is a day where we don't expect very much policy to be enacted, although we're told that the new president will sign some executive orders. He has said that he's going to have most of the business get underway on Monday, the first full workday that he'll have as president. So today will be a day for ceremony with President-elect Pence, Vice President-elect Pence, then President-elect Trump taking the oath of office, then the widely anticipated and expected to be relatively short speech from Donald Trump, his inaugural address, then the parade, and then tonight, just a handful, just three, two official, one unofficial inaugural balls. But it will be a day of extraordinary moment for the country. There's a lot of protesters in Washington, and also a lot of people very excited about seeing the change they voted for begin with what will be a speech for the ages. There's never been a president of the United States without military service or elective office service. And there you see the president-elect Donald Trump and President Obama as they get ready to be announced on the stage.
I think that one of the things, there are a lot of questions about this speech that Donald Trump's about to give. I think, inaugural addresses are obviously a great ceremony. They're a great tradition in American life. It's the case that many presidents have given them, and they have not been especially memorable. It's not obviously the case that for presidents that this is the speech that they're remembered for. There are exceptions to that. But in this case, because of the division in the country and because of the unusualness of Donald Trump on so many levels, this speech, it seems to me today, is much more important, not merely ceremonial, but much more important politically, much more important to the state of the country and how they look at Donald Trump than your average inaugural address. And I want to ask you, before we move on here, we again seeing the soon-to-be president and the soon-to-be ex-president there walking together. I want to ask you what, as you've seen the end of the transition period play out and seeing these days in the run-up to this very important day, what struck you in the last, say, 72 hours as Trump has gotten ready to take the oath?
He is a man of contradictions. He has been, before he was a politician, he certainly is now. A gracious man. There's Vice President Biden, of course, and his wife, Dr. Joe Biden. A man, and there's the incoming Vice President, Mike Pence, and his wife, Karen. He's a man of contradictions, as I said. Gracious at times and mean-spirited as others. And I think in the last 72 hours, it's been a typical Trump talking about unity, but doing some divisive things. And I think today's speech will lean towards more of the unity and we'll see whether Americans who've seen him as a divisive figure decide that that is the president they're going to get. But he has been someone as recently as last night, talking about there's the incoming president's adult children.
What will soon be the first family.
Donald Jr., there's Tiffany back there, and then Eric Trump, and there's Barron, his youngest child. This is a man who ran a divisive campaign, but one that he said was centered on bringing the country together. Every modern president has run on the notion of bringing the country together, and we'll see how today that emphasis goes, whether he talks in his speech about even some of the themes that have been more divisive rather than the broader theme of bringing the country together. This family has been part of this political journey of their fathers. They have been very focused on helping him win and now helping him govern. Ivanka Trump's husband will be a big part of the White House staff. Jared Kushner is new to politics like his father-in-law, but plans to play a major role in governing.
Seems to be one of the big questions today, Mark, is, we saw Donald Trump on election night strike a note of unity, strike a note where he tried to, and succeeded in some respects, to have a softer kind of rhetoric, a more unifying kind of rhetoric. And then what we saw over the course of the transition was the old Donald Trump in much of his public performance, and certainly in his Twitter feed. Again, combative, often provocative, and divisive, again, over the course of these last couple of months. I think everyone expects, as you just said, and rightly so, I'm sure that he will, in this formal address, try to go back to election night and the tone that he struck that night. But then the question becomes, what happens by the end of today, by tomorrow? And obviously, those are big questions for the presidency, but Trump is so unpredictable that he could easily give a unifying speech right now and within hours be doing things that will undo whatever good he does in the speech. So much. Never have we had a president-elect that presents so much unpredictability.
The central conflict, the central contradiction, Donald Trump. The Trump children being announced now to join this uniquely American tableau every 4 years on the west front of the Capitol. Politicians from both parties joining together. There's been as much divisiveness in the run-up to this ceremony as we've seen in modern American times, with several dozen Democratic members of the House of Representatives choosing to boycott this event. But obviously, the country's leading Democrats are front and center here. The Obamas, the Clintons, the Carters, joining President Bush, joining former Vice President Cheney. Bush 41, the only living president not present. He has, of course, been in the hospital in Houston. Our thoughts and prayers with the Bush family, but not well enough even before the hospitalization to travel to Washington. But the rest of leading members of America's political class all gathered here. And here, as John said, the new first family, the Trumps. There's Jared Kushner on the left there. In the dark jacket, he is going to be not just a son-in-law of the president, but a top advisor to the president. And this is, John, a very close-knit family. You can bet that although there's supposedly going to be a separation between the Trump business empire and the Trump presidency, that the adult children of Donald Trump will be front and center throughout this administration, both symbolically but also behind the scenes.
Well, and in particular, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, who there is much speculation and some informed reporting from inside this administration over the last weeks, not surprisingly, that they will be possibly the most influential people in this entire administration. Last night, Donald Trump said that, put an incredible burden, an incredible weight on Jared Kushner's shoulders, saying that he thought that he was the best suited person that Trump could imagine to bring peace to the Middle East. A rather extraordinary statement to make. And whatever you think of it on the merits, one that, again, casts a young man in his 30s with no foreign policy experience whatsoever, an extraordinary position of influence and an extraordinary amount of responsibility that Trump is openly already talking about. And then, of course, the two other boys. There is great controversy still over Trump's businesses and over conflicts of interest. Many of the ethics experts from both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrats, suspect that Donald Trump will be sued shortly after he takes the oath of office today as having violated the emoluments clause of the United States Constitution, because those conflicts are still unresolved. And again, whatever you think of those charges on the merits, this is a president-elect, now soon-to-be president, who comes into this moment with a divided country, with a minority of the popular vote. Other presidents have faced that, but it poses great political challenges. Someone who's being investigated by several branches of government for connections, his campaign's connections, potential connections with Russia and its role in the election, these business conflicts that will be a source of controversy, potentially scandal. He has an extraordinary set of political challenges to overcome if he is going to come close to making good on the grand promises that he's made to, of course, centrally make America great again in his formulation.
Let's go to Capitol Hill. Our colleague Kevin Cirilli, Bloomberg Politics, is standing by and is watching over as we see a large crowd, which I suspect Donald Trump will estimate as the largest crowd ever to attend an inaugural, although it'll probably be short of that.
30 million at least.
Kevin, let's talk about the legislative agenda. When people talk about infrastructure, tax reform, immigration, regulation as being amongst the big things to be worked on first. What is going on the legislative side? How quickly will things start to move on those fronts, and which issue do you think will move first?
We could see developments as early as tonight in terms of the incoming administration trying to really lay out their case for their priorities. I can tell you, Mark, that I've been up here on Capitol Hill for the past 2 weeks, and already Republican leadership is meeting behind closed doors with some of the incoming powers that be, if you will. People like Stephen Mnuchin and Gary Cohn are making frequent trips to Capitol Hill to meet with House Speaker Paul Ryan to begin laying out their agenda on issues like tax reform, on perhaps an infrastructure economic stimulus plan, and even, of course, immigration. But first and foremost, I think we're going to be hearing a lot over the next 3 days about repealing key parts of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare.
Kevin, it's been a somewhat chaotic transition period. Much of the government remains unfilled in the executive branch. A lot of open spaces, a lot of jobs still to be filled by the Trump administration, and many of these nominees for cabinet posts as yet unconfirmed. Some of them have had rocky hearings, some less so. Where do things stand right now, in your view, about how successful Donald Trump will be in getting all of the people that he wants into the key jobs running the government?
John, you know, I put those questions to the Democratic senators earlier this week, people like Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Bob Menendez from Massachusetts and New Jersey, respectively. And, you know, quite frankly, they were honest with me in saying that the opposition to President-elect Trump's nominees and appointees has really been largely to characterize them, to begin laying the groundwork for opposition on key issues, again, like immigration and Obamacare. But, you know, when you look at Mnuchin's nomination and you look at Rex Tillerson, they haven't really been able to convince any of their Republican colleagues to flip their vote, and that means that they will be unsuccessful in blocking any of these particular nominees.
All right, Kevin Cirilli, thanks very much. Let's go to Jenna Johnson from the Washington Post. Jenna, if you were there, you followed this campaign very closely, spent a lot of hours with Donald Trump. And have a pretty good read on his personality, on his history. What is it you think at this moment he is thinking as he prepares to take the oath of office and prepares to give this speech? What's he thinking, and what do you think he believes is his main objective today?
Well, I wish I knew exactly what Donald Trump was thinking at any given moment, but today is the day. This is the big day. He is becoming the president. And whether he ever thought he was going to get to this point or not, here he is. And just watching him this morning, there seems to be a little bit of a heavy solemnness to him. You know, starting today, he's in charge of all of this. He's going to have a lot of heavy decisions facing him. And so I think that probably the weight of this position is probably going to really hit him as he takes this. Now, as far as what he's going to say, a lot of people are hoping that he will deliver a message of unity, that he will, you know, finally reach out in a meaningful way to the people who didn't vote for him. Again, like you guys were saying earlier, he has made such comments in the past, and then his actions haven't really matched those words. So this is his opportunity to not only give a message of unity, but perhaps kind of hit the restart button and going forward, try to bring this very divided nation together.
There you see again the tableau waiting for the announcement of the vice president-elect, and expecting them to take the oath here in about half an hour, getting underway. There you see the current First Lady, Michelle Obama, and that's Nancy Pelosi's husband, Paul Pelosi. Jenna, I know we're lashed to cameras, and so reporting and talking is not always easy, but what's the latest you have on the scale of and activity of protesters in and around the inaugural event?
Well, there have been little outbursts here and there. We actually had one right across from the Washington Post building in the Franklin Square Park. A group of protesters, all dressed in black, who clashed with some police officers who were there. I mean, we're going to keep our eye on this throughout the day. The police seem to be taking a stance of not letting anything go, really confronting protesters at the perimeter. So we'll see what happens. As far as I know, it's still kind of small, isolated pockets of protesters around the perimeter.
All right, Jenna Johnson, the Washington Post, someone who's joined us throughout the election season and now here on Inauguration Day. Jenna, thank you so much. Again, there's Michelle Obama and Jill Biden, two people who are leaving government today, government housing, and the daily lies that have been their reality for the last 8 years. Both of them, I think, John, safe to say, leaving with mixed feelings, not expecting on this day to be handing things off to Donald Trump, widely expected for over a year that today would be a day when a friend of theirs, a fellow Democrat, Hillary Clinton, who's present at the event today. There you see Rick Perry, the right man in line to be the energy secretary, expecting not to be handing things off to Donald Trump today.
Well, yes, and not only is this an unexpected outcome, but for all of the people in the Obama White House, all of them have played an incredibly active role in this campaign. Barack Obama campaigned for Hillary Clinton a lot. Joe Biden campaigned for Hillary Clinton a lot. Michelle Obama had some of the most dramatic and emotional roles, gave some speeches in the fall campaign that were extraordinary on the part of a First Lady.
There you see two men who run for president, Bernie Sanders, and just to his left, John McCain, sitting side by side, another sign of the bipartisanship.
The First Lady, Mrs. Michelle Obama, and the wife of the Vice President,
Michelle
Dr.
Obama,
Jill Biden, escorted by the Democratic Staff Director of the United States Senate Committee on Rules and Administration, Kelly Fado, Ms. Irish Wineshaw, and Mr. Paul Pelosi.
So there they come. There's Michelle Obama, as I was saying a second ago, a very vocal opponent of Donald Trump's in the election. Gave these big, emotional, powerful speeches in the fall. And so I think one of the things that's interesting here is not only is this an unexpected outcome, but for all of these folks, they are going to be asking themselves for a long time, did we do enough? Did we do the right things? Did we do the wrong things? We just saw Joe Biden in the New York Times sort of soul-searching this weekend in an interview where he said he felt as though he maybe was making the wrong arguments. He wishes he said other things. They all feel as though they are trying to do the right thing for the country. President-elect Trump and his people have expressed great appreciation for the fact that the Obamas in particular have been so helpful and so gracious in trying to make this a smooth transition. And yet you know that this group of Democrats who are now exiting power are going to be having second thoughts for a long time about what unfolded and, again, the role they played and what the potential consequences might be for Democratic priorities and for the country of this highly unusual new president.
There you see on the far end of your screen, of course, President Bush 43 in his usual jocular mood. You look at the Clintons' faces throughout. We've been watching them all morning. Just extraordinary, textured and rich visages of the two people who probably are, I'd say, safe to say, experienced as much emotion today as anybody up there. We're expecting shortly the new First Lady and the new wife of the Vice President, Mike Pence, Karen Pence, to be coming out shortly. This is Bloomberg's coverage of the inauguration. There you see a nice wide high shot to see the scope. And while that looks like a lot of people, the wide expectation and based on what previous inaugurals have looked like is this will be a smaller crowd than Barack Obama got certainly 8 years ago. Let's bring in our colleague Mike McKee, who's also in Washington, to talk about the Trump agenda. We talked a little bit with Kevin Cirilli about that. Mike, talk about what you see happening executive orders, legislative action in the early days, and how you think the wider world, including the markets, will react to that.
Well, now we're getting to the point where Donald Trump is going to see the problems from translating his rhetoric into reality, and they start here on Capitol Hill because there is no unity. Normally, the political dynamic is Republicans against Democrats, but here you've got Republicans against Democrats and Republicans against Republicans, and Trump's going to have some trouble getting much of his agenda through. The first thing they seem to want to focus on is Obamacare, and they can do the repeal fairly quickly, but they have no agreement on what they would replace it with. And the president-elect, soon to be president, says he wants repeal and replace at the same time. He also suggested that he'll have his own plan coming out when Tom Price is confirmed as HHS secretary. That could be mid-February. So we're on a waiting mode for that. 4 committees have to deal with Obamacare replacement. So that's going to tie up a lot of members of the Senate in particular. And so it's going to be hard for them to move forward on tax reform and on infrastructure spending. So the analysts I've been talking to and the members of Congress I've been speaking with say this is going to be a much more drawn out process than Donald Trump expected. It's going to take them well into the summer to get anything passed. So probably nothing will start to affect the economy and therefore the markets until late 2017 or early 2018. If you're going to look for something to affect the markets, it may be a stray Trump comment like his talk of the dollar the other day, or it could be some sort of foreign policy situation.
Mike, just pause for 1 second. We're watching Melania Trump, the new First Lady, or soon-to-be First Lady, making her entrance at the inaugural ceremony here, looking extremely elegant in that blue coat that she's in. And there we see the U.S. Capitol as people ready to prepare for her to make her first appearance on the dais. Mike, let me come back to you and just ask you this question, having kind of boiled down. You know, I understand that there's a great sense that Trump's ambitious agenda is going to run into some typical and some atypical roadblocks and obstacles. He's going to want to put some wins on the board, though.
Mrs. Karen Pence, escorted by the Secretary of
and
the
here
Senate,
come
Julie Adams,
Melania Trump and Karen
the
Pence.
House of Representatives, Karen Haas, Mrs. Abigail Blunt, Mrs. Jana Ryan, the Honorable Elaine L. Chao, and Mrs. Judy McCarthy.
So, Mike, given those realities, the Trump administration is obviously going to want to put some wins on the board in that first 100 days. It's not going to do for them, given their current political circumstances, to wait until the summer before they can chalk up a win. So where do you see easy, low-hanging fruit for the Trump administration to, as I say, put some points on the board quick?
Probably the easiest low-hanging fruit is for him to issue executive orders repealing Obama executive orders on regulation. And he'll be able to trumpet the idea that they are moving to clear the underbrush of the things that hold back American business. He may also do something on immigration. He has some discretion there, although the changes may not be as big as he promised people, because he himself has realized in recent days that the Obama administration was already doing much of the things that he had talked about, like prioritizing deporting criminals. But he can issue executive orders and use previously existing legislation to start some sort of construction project on his famous wall. So they can get some talking points out of regulation and immigration. It's going to be harder in other areas.
All right. Thanks, Mike McKee. We're now watching there the outgoing president of the United States, Barack Obama, and his partner, Vice President Biden, making that walk out to say farewell.
You're watching the last dignitaries going to a place, the coming of Barack Obama and Joe Biden, out escorted by Nancy Pelosi to the platform. This Bloomberg Politics live coverage of the inauguration of Donald J. Trump to be president. In a moment, we'll see both the incoming Vice President Mike Pence of Indiana, Donald Trump of New York. Both will come out and take the stage, and then we'll see some remarks before the administering of the oaths to both gentlemen and the transfer of power. There's Melania Trump with her son Barron and the other Trump children behind them. Joining us now also from Washington, another of our colleague, Margaret Talev, who covered the campaign, also covered Barack Obama for a long time. Margaret, Barack Obama's been pretty active over the last week. Press conference, a farewell address, radio address that was given a lot of attention. What's he trying to do here? Hold on to the last moments, or did he want to drive some messages here in the end to have an impact on perhaps his successor or the country's view of his legacy?
Yeah, Mark, it's really a little bit all of the above, but part of what he's trying to do is set the parameters and the boundaries at which he would re-engage if Donald Trump crosses certain lines. And part is to cement as much as he can, even in the face of some of those repeals of executive orders, a lot of the policies that he put in motion,
Ladies
or at
and
least
gentlemen, the President
core
of the
them,
United States,
from healthcare to the
Honorable
environment
Barack
to
H.
foreign
Obama,
policy.
and
Margaret,
Vice
hold on here, the
President
announcement of the
Joseph R.
current president.
Escorted by Senate Democratic Secretary Gary Myrick, Senate Democratic Leader and Rules Committee Ranking Member Charles E. Schumer, and House Democratic Leader Nancy Pelosi.
Two men who have formed just a giant partnership over the last 8 years. Had a little bit of a bumpy relationship in the Senate when they both served there. Both ran for president in 2008 as rivals and then teamed up to win the White House twice and have become, as Barack Obama said the other day about Joe Biden when he gave him the Medal of Freedom, brothers. A truly remarkable story of two guys going from rivals, John, to close governing partners.
We have seen some vice presidents in the last few administrations, Joe Biden, Dick Cheney, Al Gore, who are among the most powerful vice presidents, the most influential vice presidents in our entire history. But genuinely, I think what's most unusual here is that there was not a bond between George W. Bush and Dick Cheney like this one. There was not a bond between Bill Clinton and Al Gore like this one. The bond between these two men, as you said, has just been, in politics, partners often talk about how close they've become. It is watching these two over the last 8 years, but particularly just in the last couple of weeks, it is just incontrovertible how much they genuinely love each other. And it is something I think we rarely ever see in politics, where so many relationships and so many partnerships are essentially formed around political necessity and self-interest. This one seems to have transcended that in a quite remarkable way.
Extraordinary look at American political royalty, if you will. The Obamas there. You see Jimmy Carter. Here's, again, the Trump family, the incoming First Lady on the far left of your screen. And there's Ivanka Trump and Don Jr. But back here, there's Joe Biden and Dane Quayle there behind President Obama, Joe Biden. The Clintons up there as well, the Bushes, the Cheneys. This is all the living vice presidents and presidents, save Bush 41 and Barbara Bush, who are back in Houston recovering now. And there's the Supreme Court members, greeted by President Obama. The people you see up there mix those big people who aren't known to you are the Secret Service agents who are there protecting the most valuable human commodities in the country.
Here we see Donald Trump about to make his way out. We have a couple pieces of reporting that are worth mentioning, one of which is that Sean Spicer, the incoming White House press secretary, has told Bloomberg that there will be no excerpts provided before Donald Trump's speech. So we are going to hear when he speaks, unlike many cases where reporters are given transcripts beforehand and we know what they're going to say or what they're planning to say at least a few minutes before they speak. In this case, Donald Trump will be speaking with having given no preview to the members of the press. So we will be, like all viewers at home, here surprised by whatever comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. The other piece of reporting we have is the Associated Press saying that there is now some violent protests going on in Washington, D.C., and the police have used pepper spray to try to quell those protests. Restaurant windows have been smashed downtown. So there was a lot of discussion about how much upset and how much unrest there would be around this inauguration. Apparently, at least some of that is now coming to fruition on the streets of Washington.
There you see just a small part of the law enforcement contingency, federal and local, that is all over the nation's capital. You'll see reports about protests. We'll keep you posted on them, but we'll also try to give you a good sense of the perspective of the scale and scope of them, how large they are. But that's going to be part of the tableau of the day. But the main event here, see President-elect Trump about to come out. He's with the Republican congressional leaders who will escort him out. And that is a pretty somber-looking, serious-looking Donald Trump. But I suspect we'll see moments of levity. He is a guy who understands the flow of a live event, and I think he's going to balance a lot of different things today. Mike Pence, president-elect, hasn't gotten much attention. John was talking about the influence of Joe Biden quite accurately of how influential he was. But Mike Pence has been a big part of the campaign, big part of the transition, which he actually ran, and a lot of his allies are going to be in senior positions in the government. And John, I suspect Mike Pence will join Dick Cheney, Al Gore, and Joe Biden as an historically influential vice president, particularly in dealing with congressional relations. Of course, governor of Indiana now, but he's been, or was governor of Indiana, but he's been for a long time, was a leading member of the House of Representatives from the Hoosier State.
It's so important in the context of an outsider president to have a governing partner in Mike Pence who's a consummate insider, someone who's a familiar quantity for Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill. If things are going to get done in the Trump administration, Mike Pence will be a big part of it. I want to go back to Margaret Taleb and ask you, Margaret, just because of your long history covering Barack Obama, we were talking to you about this. Mark was talking to you about it before we had to break away. The liberals around the country, the thing I hear most from them in the last couple months is sort of hope that Barack Obama not only will set parameters for engagement, but will be actively engaged as an ex-president. I would say 6 months ago, no one would have expected Barack Obama to be a particularly active ex-president. Now there's hope and expectation that he might be. What's your sense of how realistic it is for Democrats and liberals to think that Barack Obama is going to be intervening in the political scene with any regularity in the months ahead?
I would totally bet on that happening, but what's not yet clear is how much will be in front, as in the public face, and how much will be behind the scenes in terms of helping with fundraising, connecting, and shaping messages. I think part of what he is waiting to do, to see now, is kind of what works best. He doesn't want to keep stealing the thunder from the Democratic Party. They need to come up with their next generation of leaders. It can't be him and Joe Biden anymore.
Committee on Inaugural Ceremonies, Roy Blunt. Rules Committee ranking member and Senate Democratic leader Charles E. Schumer.
We're watching the introduction here of the congressional leadership, the Republican leaders, the Speaker of the House, and there's the Minority Leader, Nancy Pelosi. Margaret, you've been in Washington for the week, and we haven't. So just tell us a little bit about the mood of the city in terms of, is it celebratory? Is it on lockdown because of security? What's it been like?
Yeah, it was really perceptible over the last few days. You could see kind of the feel and the look of the crowd changing in those blocks right around the White House. And the last couple of days, as they began erecting those physical barriers, the tall, chain fences, you'd see the crowds lined up at the coffee shops. They looked really different than the Obama staffers who used to hang out there. Americans from other parts of the country wearing the Make America Great caps. This is a real change of the guard, a dramatic change of the guard. A lot of those raw emotions are still here, even as Democrats are coming to accept this. The one thing that we haven't seen yet is what President Obama wrote to Donald Trump in that letter.
Just hold on one second, Margaret. We just had the President-elect Donald J. Trump, the official announcement, as he comes out, gives the thumbs up, and heads down to the podium. Just pause and look at this for a moment. Image that very few Americans just months ago ever imagined they would see. President-elect kissing his wife, shaking hands and giving a kiss on the cheek to the First Lady. Now shaking hands with the man whose job he is about to take. Mark, I ask you, you are a great student of Donald Trump and have seen him in a lot of settings. Just look at that face and the visage there. Give me a sense of how you think what he's conveying here. He does not look uncomfortable to me, but he does not look especially jocular either. This is a very somber-looking Donald Trump to me, but you're a better student of him.
He's got his serious face on, but you can see little signs that I think he's going to do a variety of tones today, because that's what he does. He is underestimated in so many ways. This is Roy Blunt, the senator from Missouri, who's in charge of this event, the administrator, basically, of putting on the inaugural. We'll listen a little bit to see, but these will be mostly perfunctory remarks. So John and I will chat a little bit and bring our colleagues back in. But we're just a little while away, less than 20 minutes from the administration of the oath of office to first Mike Pence and then Donald Trump from two Supreme Court justices. We want to go back to our colleague, Margaret Taleb. Margaret, tradition is for presidents to pass on advice to their successors. Barack Obama and Donald Trump have had a colloquy going on since the day after the election. where he's been giving advice, but talk about what we know about the things that Barack Obama has been conveying to Donald Trump and how Donald Trump's reacted.
His first inauguration, we know that Barack Obama has signaled to Donald Trump, number one, that he is always going to be there for him to reach out to and that he hopes he'll take advantage of that. And two, the idea that the U.S. is a very big ship and you don't just take the steering wheel and turn it around, whether it's on foreign policy, domestic policy, spending, to take great care before you initiate something that you can't roll back. He signaled that to him publicly and in private, and in these sort of tertiary conversations between Joe Biden and Mike Pence, between Susan Rice and Mike Flynn at the National Security Council. It is sort of this consistent message that every president has a right to set his own policies, but that the world looks to the United States for consistency, for reliability, and to set the tone for the world. And that even if you have something that you think is a very good idea, it's smart to take your time about it. You mentioned advice between presidents. The kind of epitome of this tradition comes in the form of a letter that the outgoing president leaves in the Resolute desk at the Oval Office for the incoming president. President Obama has done that, has left that letter for Donald Trump. We don't yet know what the letter says. The outgoing White House so far declining to release the text of that letter. It may just be ceremonial and say, I wish you well. It may have, in fact, some advice in it as well.
Jenna Johnson, I know you have to leave soon, so I want to come to you and ask you sort of the flip side of the question we were just discussing with Margaret Talev. Donald Trump has reached out to Barack Obama a fair amount, we know, in the course of the transition. Someone who he mocked and ridiculed and launched conspiracy theories against before he won this election. He has said that he appreciates President Obama's advice. He's spoken of him very fondly over the course of the last couple of months. Is it your sense that Trump has had a genuine change of heart about the President of the United States? Or that he is just saying things that he believes he should say as a matter of kind of form and decorum, being respectful towards the man whose job he's about to inherit?
I think it's a little bit of both. The outgoing president is very, very popular right now, much more popular than Donald Trump is. And so I think he's also realized that it can be good for him to be friendly with President Obama. The two have had very long telephone conversations talking about problems facing the country. Donald Trump says he's even run some of his cabinet picks past the president and got his thoughts on that. So we'll see. The minute that President Obama is critical of Donald Trump, though, you see Donald Trump punch back at him right away. So it'll be interesting to see how these two continue this relationship going forward. It seems like Donald Trump really does genuinely appreciate the president's point of view and seems to be seeking it out in a way. We'll see if that can continue, especially as we expect the President Obama to be a big critic of the incoming administration.
This is Cardinal Dolan of New York, the Archbishop of New York. Let's listen.
All things, and in your providence have charged us to rule the creatures produced by you, to govern the world in holiness and righteousness, and to render judgment with integrity of heart. Give us wisdom, for we are your servants, weak and short-lived, lacking in comprehension of judgment and of laws. Indeed, though one might be perfect among mortals, if wisdom which comes from you be lacking, we count for nothing. Now with you is wisdom, who knows your will and was there when you made the world, who understands what is pleasing in your eyes, what is conformable with your commands. Send her forth from your holy heavens, from your glorious throne dispatch her, that she may be with us and work with us, that we may grasp what is pleasing to you. For she knows and understands all things, and will guide us prudently in our affairs and safeguard us by her glory. Amen.
So the first of several religious leaders who will speak, they're about 15 minutes behind schedule. It's going to be interesting to see how they make it up because, of course, they need to make sure they get the oath administered in time. But this is, like I said, about 15 minutes behind schedule. I want to ask Jenna Johnson one more question before we have to let her go. And Jenna, that's about what I asked Margaret. I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about how Washington seems on this day. Is it seem celebratory out there, or a city braced for security? What is the dominant feel of the city as you've experienced it?
The city is very, very quiet. I was surprised by how quiet it was this morning. A lot of people who live here have left for the weekend. My neighborhood was very quiet this morning. I was able to get an Uber within a couple minutes and not pay any surge pricing. The crowd seems smaller than it has been at the last two inaugurations, and there are people out and about. The thing that we're really keeping an eye on is the protests. I mean, the nation is very divided right now. For as many people as there are who are very excited about Donald Trump's becoming president and are here in the city to see him take the oath, there are a lot of people who are very scared about the future, are very upset that he's going to be the president, and are pushing back by protesting. So everyone here is hoping that doesn't get ugly, that people don't get hurt.
You, Heavenly Father.
Jenna Johnson, thank you very much. I know we have to let you go. Thanks for being with us on this important historic day. Margaret Taleb, I want to come back to you for one last question. We know you have to go too. Margaret, Mark and I both made reference to the fact that you covered the Obama administration and covered Barack Obama's campaigns, both of them. I'm curious as to when you think back to 8 years ago when President Obama came into office. Obviously, there's so much atmospherically that's different between this inauguration and that inauguration. But one of the things that was true 8 years ago was that Barack Obama basically governed. We had Democratic majorities in the House and Senate. He governed on the basis of that. Did not reach across the aisle very much. The things he passed, the big things he passed, were mostly or almost exclusively with Democratic votes. Do you think that Donald Trump will be different, or in this respect, do you think that Trump will be much like President Obama, with Republican majorities in the House and Senate, governing in a pure Republican way, or do you think we're likely to see genuine outreach to try to form bipartisan coalitions on big things going forward?
It's such a smart question, John, because I think Donald Trump has the ability to do something that Barack Obama really didn't have after he spent his political capital on Obamacare. There are a number of vulnerable Democrats in swing states. And if he positions himself right, he may be able to convince them to go along with him. Democrats have not made that same pledge that Republicans did strategically to obstruct at all costs. It works differently in their party with their voters and in today's dynamic. Donald Trump also has the lessons of Barack Obama that he can take away from. But one difference today, as he takes the oath of office, is that he starts with a much smaller, narrower coalition and much less public approval for his bully pulpit. That also may force him to direct himself differently in the weeks and months to come.
Margaret, thank you. This is speaking now Pastor Paula White-Cain of the New Destiny Christian Center. She's a longtime friend of Donald Trump, the first woman pastor to ever lead a prayer at an inaugural ceremony. Pretty extraordinary that has not happened up until now. But she will speak, then we'll have a little bit more pomp and circumstance, and then the main event, the swearing in and Donald Trump's speech. Let's get a quick word in from Mike McKee, we spoke to earlier, about Congress and about a gentleman you've seen up there pretty prominently today, Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader who has been playing a major role in slowing down the confirmation process of a number of Trump nominees for the cabinet. But also, Mike, would need to be a big partner of Donald Trump if Trump's going to have any bipartisan achievements.
Yes, he's going to need Chuck Schumer because at this point, as I mentioned earlier, Republicans are divided, perhaps more than the Democratic caucus, between the Tea Party types who don't want to spend more money and the Republicans who want to go along with Donald Trump's tax cuts, etc. So he's going to need some Democratic votes on a lot of different issues. And Chuck Schumer is in a good position to decide who gets the votes and when. Schumer stopped by this morning. We had a brief chat, and he said that he is going to take the issues one by one and Donald Trump's proposals one by one and see what he thinks of each one. He's already made a decision on cabinet officials. He's delaying the vote on everybody except General Mattis and General Kelly today to be members of the cabinet until at least next week. So he's already working to slow down the Trump train, as it were.
Mike, I mentioned earlier that Donald Trump is unusual in a variety of ways. One of them is that he has these very particular and unique challenges, one of which is the investigations going on about Russia's intervention in our electoral process, another of which is the ethics cloud that continues to hang over him, having decided not to fully divest himself from his businesses. Of those kinds of political challenges, which are the ones that you think might be the biggest impediment to Trump getting business done? Where's he going to have the biggest problem, again, on those kinds of fronts?
Well, he's probably going to be able to survive any kind of lawsuit over the emoluments clause. The GSA said to be readying something for as soon as today, once he has taken office, because his supporters believe it's just all political and just an effort to get him. And also, members of the Republican Party up here seem willing to overlook a lot of that. It would be something that maybe came out of the Russia investigations that are underway that could erode support on Capitol Hill for him, that could cause him problems, or it could be the fact that he just comes into office as the lowest rated president since polling began and doesn't have any political capital. There isn't going to be a groundswell of people calling in to congressional offices to support some of his initiatives, and that could be the real problem that he faces. He may have to give a lot of ground to members of Congress, particularly Paul Ryan, and in terms of what he is going to be able to get done.
Mike, thank you very much. Go back to Kevin Cirilli, our colleague also on Capitol Hill. And Kevin, you were making a point I saw on Twitter about the woman we just saw speaking, Trump's longtime friend, Donald Trump's longtime friend, Pastor Paula White-Cain. Talk about what her place here and her prominence in this ceremony says to you.
Well, you have to remember that Paula White is a longtime friend of Donald Trump, someone who represents the newer age, if you will, of evangelicalism, and someone who has theological prosperity background, someone that uses television and celebrity to help bring about her version of evangelicalism. So to see that juxtaposed with Cardinal Dolan, someone with arguably the most influential Catholic in American culture right now, is quite an embrace of what the religious movement really did mean to Donald Trump, who was quite controversial, to say the least, for a period of time within many evangelical circles. And seeing them up there together on that stage is a big reason for why he himself is about to take that podium.
Kevin, you covered the Trump campaign. You saw the Never Trump movement take shape and then fade away and not have very much effect. Donald Trump says it was all sort of a fantasy. It never really existed. But the reality is that a lot of Republicans who have now rallied around Trump, in fact, are still have profound disagreements with him ideologically and on policy. So my question is, how long do you think the current picture of Republican unity will last? How fragile is it, or how sturdy is it at this moment?
I'm not sure that it's going to last that long, and I'm not sure that all of the divisions between the Never Trumpers and the Trump administration have healed. And in fact, if you talk with aides within the Trump political orbit, they still do remember those divisions. And so while on one hand, Trump is trying to unite the party, he is also trying to reward loyalty. I would anticipate, John, that storyline and that political arc is something that we are going to be following well within the first administration. To take a step back, though, and just to remember just how far Trump has come since he first began his political campaign in a scrappy campaign office with a startup feel environment inside Trump Tower, when he only had a handful of, quite frankly, then amateur staffers. And now to see the political apparatus that surrounds him and the team that will be in place within an hour and minutes after he takes that oath of office is truly, I think, can't be understated in this particular moment.
Kevin Cirilli, thank you very much. Here is Chuck Schumer, the Democratic leader, the top Democrat in the Senate, the most powerful Democrat in government, starting in just a few minutes. Donald Trump's fellow New Yorker. We talked with Mike McKee about the fact that he would be central to any legislating that goes on in the Congress that requires a bipartisan tint. Chuck Schumer is leading up to introducing Clarence Thomas, the Associate Justice Supreme Court, and then we'll see Mike Pence. As with Donald Trump, a guy who was underrated, was facing a tough re-election battle in Indiana to be governor, and instead dropped that race, joined the ticket, and now finds himself headed to the White House to be part of a governing team, a Trump-Pence team that is going to change Washington quite fundamentally. Mike Pence is going to be using a Bible that's only been used previously for presidential swearing-in, vice presidential swearing-in by Ronald Reagan, a Bible Ronald Reagan used both in California, being sworn in as governor, and then being sworn in twice as president. Mike Pence, like a lot of conservatives of his generation, a big follower of Ronald Reagan and Ronald Reagan's not just policies but governing style, and certainly fancies himself a Reagan Republican, but is now also a Trump Republican. Those things have some similarities but also some real differences. You're watching Bloomberg Politics live coverage of the swearing in of Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States. We're going to hear, though, in a moment when Chuck Schumer finishes speaking, from Mike Pence. Let's listen a little bit to Senator Schumer, the Democrat from New York.
For their first battle, a time when our country was bitterly divided and faith in the future of our country was at a nadir, Major Ballou of the 2nd Rhode Island Volunteers penned a letter to his wife, Sarah. It is one of the greatest letters in American history. It shows the strength and courage of the average American. Allow me to read some of his words, which echo through the ages. My very dear Sarah, he wrote, the indications are very strong that we shall move in a few days, perhaps tomorrow. If it is necessary that I should fall on the battlefield for my country, I am ready. I have no misgivings about or lack of confidence in the cause in which I am engaged, and my courage does not halt or falter. I know how strongly American civilization now leans upon the triumph of the government, and how great a debt we owe to those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt. Sarah, my love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me to you with the mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence can break. And yet, my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly on with all these chains to the battlefield. Sullivan Ballou gave his life on the battlefield a week later at the first battle of Bull Run. It is because Sullivan Ballou and countless others believed in something bigger than themselves and were willing to sacrifice for it that we stand today in the full blessings of liberty, in the greatest country on earth. And that spirit lives on in each of us, Americans whose families have been here for generations and those who have just arrived. And I know our best days are yet to come. I urge all Americans to read Ballou's full letter. His words give me solace, strength. I hope they will give you the same. Now, please stand while the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, administers the oath of office to the Vice President of the United States.
Clarence Thomas and Mike Pence, both out of the conservative movement of the same generation. Thomas is older, but they came of age at the time when Ronald Reagan was the leading light of the Republican Party. Let's listen.
Mr. Vice President-elect, would you raise your right hand and repeat after me? I, Michael Richard Pence, do solemnly swear.
I, Michael Richard Pence, do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I take this obligation freely,
that I take this obligation freely,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge,
and that I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties of the office on which I'm about to enter.
The duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Mike Pence now sworn in as the Vice President of the United States. An extraordinary story for him. A guy who had presidential ambitions and looked like his national political career might be on the ropes as he faced a tough re-election battle in Indiana, and instead accepted an offer from a man who was a stranger to him, Donald Trump. Trump looked around for a vice presidential candidate and eventually settled on someone he did not know well. It's been the pattern for Trump as he fills out his cabinet as well. Some close friends, but a lot of people who are new to him. And he and Mike Pence, John, have formed a very quick and close bond.
It's absolutely correct, and as we were saying earlier, I mean, in many ways, because of Pence's experience in Washington, because of his familiarity with leaders on Capitol Hill, especially on the Republican Party, apart from his children, apart from Ivanka Trump in particular, and her husband Jared Kushner, Mike Pence may be, in that group of the most important people in this administration, and someone who not just important in terms of giving advice to Trump, but in terms of actually executing an agenda. That gentleman right there could matter more in some respects than Donald Trump himself.
There are a lot of Republicans who take solace, who are worried about Donald Trump and his unpredictable ways,
accompanied by the president's own United States
are glad Mike Pence is there, even if they don't always agree with him on policy.
Donald Trump.
This is the Mormon Tabernacle Choir singing America the Beautiful. John, as we listen to that, let's talk about this swearing-in moment. John Roberts is Chief Justice of the United States, has not been without controversy. We'll recall what happened when he swore in Barack Obama. But the Supreme Court is front and center now. There's a vacancy on the court, of course. It will be one of the first big battles.
And then, look, you've seen not only that this obviously comes in the wake of a year in which that Supreme Court vacancy was not filled. Republicans refused to have hearings for President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, a relatively centrist judge who many Democrats feel was blocked in a wholly inappropriate and unconstitutional way. There's now a question of whether there will be payback on Democrats' part, whoever Donald Trump nominates. Mormon Tabernacle Choir, finishing off America the Beautiful. We're now going to see Roy Blunt bring up Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts to administer the oath of office to Donald Trump. He'll be taking with President Lincoln's inauguration Bible, used during the very first inauguration back in 1861.
Everyone, please stand.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Donald Trump has been sworn in, 45th President of these United States. A remarkable moment in American history, something that almost no Democrats, a fair number of Republicans, and even many of Donald Trump's closest advisors and friends did not believe would happen until about 10 o'clock on election night. Let's listen to Roy Blunt.
Anywhere, the 45th President of the United States of America, Donald J. Trump.
Did I get that one right?
Chief Justice Roberts, President Carter, President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama, fellow Americans, and people of the world, thank you. We, the citizens of America, are now joined in a great national effort to rebuild our country and restore its promise for all of our people. Together, we will determine the course of America and the world for many, many years to come. We will face challenges. We will confront hardships, but we will get the job done. Every 4 years, we gather on these steps to carry out the orderly and peaceful transfer of power. And we are grateful to President Obama and First Lady Michelle Obama for their gracious aid throughout this transition. They have been magnificent. Thank you. Today's ceremony, however, has very special meaning, because today we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people. For too long, a small group in our nation's capital has reaped the rewards of government while the people have borne the cost. Washington flourished, but the people did not share in its wealth. Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across our land. That all changes starting right here and right now, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. It belongs to everyone gathered here today and everyone watching all across America. This is your day. This is your celebration. And this, the United States of America, is your country. What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. Everyone is listening to you now. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens. Americans want great schools for their children, safe neighborhoods for their families, and good jobs for themselves. These are just and reasonable demands of righteous people and a righteous public. But for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities. Rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. An education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge. And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now. We are one nation, and their pain is our pain. Their dreams are our dreams, and their success will be our success. We share one heart, one home, and one glorious destiny. The oath of office I take today is an oath of allegiance to all Americans. For many decades, we've enriched foreign industry at the expense of American industry, subsidized the armies of other countries while allowing for the very sad depletion of our military. We've defended other nations' borders while refusing to defend our own. and spent trillions and trillions of dollars overseas, while America's infrastructure has fallen into disrepair and decay. We've made other countries rich, while the wealth, strength, and confidence of our country has dissipated over the horizon. One by one, the factories shuttered and left our shores, with not even a thought about the millions and millions of American workers that were left behind. The wealth of our middle class has been ripped from their homes and then redistributed all across the world. But that is the past, and now we are looking only to the future. We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, in every foreign capital, and in every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries making our products, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. Protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down. America will start winning again, winning like never before. We will bring back our jobs. We will bring back our borders. We will bring back our wealth. And we will bring back our dreams. We will build new roads and highways and bridges and airports and tunnels and railways all across our wonderful nation. We will get our people off of welfare and back to work, rebuilding our country with American hands and American labor. We will follow two simple rules: buy American and hire American. We will seek friendship and goodwill with the nations of the world, but we do so with the understanding that it is the right of all nations to put their own interests first. We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example. We will shine for everyone to follow. We will reinforce old alliances and form new ones and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth. At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. And through our loyalty to our country, we will rediscover our loyalty to each other. When you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. The Bible tells us how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity. We must speak our minds openly, debate our disagreements honestly, but always pursue solidarity. When America is united, America is totally unstoppable. There should be no fear. We are protected, and we will always be protected. We will be protected by the great men and women of our military and law enforcement. And most importantly, we will be protected by God. Finally, we must think big and dream even bigger. In America, we understand that a nation is only living as long as it is striving. We will no longer accept politicians who are all talk and no action, constantly complaining but never doing anything about it. The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action. Do not allow anyone to tell you that it cannot be done. No challenge can match the heart and fight and spirit of America. We will not fail. Our country will thrive and prosper again. We stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space, to free the earth from the miseries of disease, and to harness the energies, industries, and technologies of tomorrow. A new national pride will stir our souls, lift our sights, and heal our divisions. It's time to remember that old wisdom our soldiers will never forget, that whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots. We all enjoy the same glorious freedoms, and we all salute the same great American flag. And whether a child is born in the urban sprawl of Detroit or the windswept plains of Nebraska, they look up at the same night sky, they fill their heart with the same dreams, and they are infused with the breath of life by the same almighty Creator. So to all Americans in every city, near and far, small and large, from mountain to mountain, from ocean to ocean, hear these words: you will never be ignored again. Your voice, your hopes, and your dreams will define our American destiny. And your courage and goodness and love will forever guide us along the way. Together, we will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And yes, together, we will make America great again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you. God bless America.
A 70-year-old former New York real estate developer tries his hand at politics and ends up 45th President of the United States. Donald Trump, in a relatively short inaugural speech, thematic, economic populism. That was not a Republican speech, John. That was a Trump speech on economics, on foreign policy. No one in that 16-minute speech would be surprised by anything he said if they listened to not just what he campaigned on, but what he's been talking about, particularly on the American economy, for decades.
Yes, it is 100% true. I mean, there are a lot of things to say about this relatively short speech. One of them derives directly from the point you were making, Mark, which is that this was a speech that was very close to countless speeches that he gave on the campaign trail in 2016. Typically, presidents, when they take the inaugural, move into a different kind of rhetorical mode, somewhat more ornate, often more with more historical reference points, attempts at poetry. I say this not in a spirit of criticism at all, but simply just as a fact. Donald Trump did not try to do those things in this speech, and we could talk more about what he did try to do, but he spoke in plain and colloquial language, a lot of short declarative sentences, some rather extraordinarily grand promises, including, "I will never, ever let you down." But this was the rhetoric that carried him to the Oval Office. And he went back to the thematics, some of them dark, some of them hopeful and optimistic, that became the staples of the Trump campaign rallies, that generated a huge amount of enthusiasm among a large, not a majority of the electorate, but a large minority, a large plurality of the electorate. This was the kind of speech that if he had to give this speech, if he had to give this inaugural the day after Election Day, it would have been very similar, because this is, again, incredibly consistent with the rhetoric that carried him throughout half of 2015 and all through 2016 as he waged his battle to win the White House.
Let's listen to Rabbi Marvin Heyer of the Seaman Wiesenthal Center.
For they have no one but their fellow citizens, and because a nation's wealth is measured by her values and not by her vaults. Bless all of our allies around the world who share our beliefs. By the rivers of Babylon, we wept as we remembered Zion. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. The doer of all these shall never falter. May the days come soon when justice will dwell in the wilderness and righteousness will abide in the fertile fields, and the work of righteousness will be peace, quietness, and confidence forever. Amen.
Mr. President, in the Bible, rain is a sign of God's blessing. And it started to rain, Mr. President, when you came to the platform. And it's my prayer that God will bless you, your family, your administration, and may He bless America. The passage of Scripture comes from 1 Timothy chapter 2. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings, for all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good, and it pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all people. Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. In Jesus' name, amen.
That was Reverend Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son, and a big Donald Trump supporter throughout the campaign, handing off for the benediction to Bishop Wayne T. Jackson of the Great Faith Ministries International.
This great moment together. Let us not take for granted the air we breathe or the life you've given us. We were all created by you with one blood, all nations to dwell upon this land together. We're not enemies, but brothers and sisters. We're not adversaries, but we're allies. We're not foes, but we're friends. Let us be healed by the power of your love and united by the bond of your spirit. Today, we pray for our 45th president, the vice president, and their families, and give them the wisdom to guide this great nation, the strength to protect it, and the hands to heal it. We bless President Donald J. Trump. We ask that you give him the wisdom of Solomon, the vision of Joseph, and the meekness of Christ. Solomon, who kept peace among many nations, Joseph, who dreamt better for the people, and Christ, who accepted us all. O Lord, mend our hearts and stitch together the fabric of this great country in the spirit of the legendary gospel songwriter Mahalia Jackson. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe the Lord will see us through. I do believe we are on our way to victory. I do believe we will walk hand in hand. I do believe we shall live in peace. I do believe. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe America, we shall overcome. May the Lord bless and keep America, and make his face shine upon us, and be gracious unto us, and give us peace. In the mighty name of Jesus, amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jackie Evancho, accompanied
towards the end of our program here, benediction by Wayne T. Jackson. This will be the national anthem performed by Jackie Evancho. Donald Trump has tweeted about her. She's 16 years old. She finished second on the program America's Got Talent 7 years ago. She sang for President Obama at the National Prayer Breakfast in 2012. Here she is, the national anthem.
That was Jackie Evancho performing the national anthem. Donald Trump seems to have enjoyed it.
Please remain standing while the president and
coming to the end of this ceremony here. Mark, I want to return back to Donald Trump's speech before we go to some of our colleagues down in Washington and get your view. It reminded me on reflection, as I sit here looking at my notes from the speech, very much in keeping, as I was saying before, with his campaign rhetoric, but in particular his speech to the Republican National Convention, which many people saw as a dark speech. And there were elements of that here as he described America as he sees it today. American carnage, talked about gangs and drugs and rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, describing a very dystopian America, and then pivoting to what he promises will come next in a more hopeful and optimistic vein. Again, that speech was the speech that he gave in Cleveland. Some people thought it was fantastic. Other people thought it was a bit too dark and Nixonian. Just give me your sense of what your views are, just of the speech in general, and of how it fits in and where and how it will be seen historically.
Well, relatively short by modern standards, about the same length as George W. Bush's inaugural address. But it was typical of how Donald Trump communicates. A lot of darkness, a lot of description of the current state of America, particularly related to crime and drugs and the economy, that Donald Trump does feel is dark. He has always been inspired by the grievance part of the American psyche when it comes to why one wants to get involved in politics. This is a guy who then, as he did in the speech today, will always pivot and say things are going to be better. You know, I'm sure his critics will note the irony of a guy saying the time for talk is over, words don't matter, politicians make promises they don't keep, who now has made some pretty grand promises about never letting the country down, about bringing jobs back, about defeating terrorism, that no one expects the specifics today in a speech like this, but where his prescriptions during the campaign and even during the transition were pretty short on specifics. So he's left himself no wiggle room. He says America's in a bad position, and he's going to make it better, and he'll never let the country down. And again, his critics will say, you haven't told us how, and now we'll expect a fair amount of progress in short order if he's going to live up to what he laid out today. But as you suggested before, most inaugural addresses have something in it that's surprising or news-making, with the exception of a few of the phrases Trump used about buy American, hire American, talking about carnage. This was a newsless speech, and it is simply a reaffirmation of Donald Trump's vision for what ails the country and what he plans to do about it thematically, not programmatically, in the next 4 years.
I think if you were to go back and look at a lot of inaugurals going back, at least in the modern era, you would find Republican and Democrat alike a couple of things, one of which is an attempt to at least reach for poetry. Donald Trump very consciously not doing that. You can see that as a positive thing or a negative thing. I mean, he's speaking the common language of the common people, but not an attempt to be poetic. Another thing that inaugurals normally do is try to hark back to American history. I would bet there's not been an inaugural in our lifetimes, and probably stretching back further than that, where new presidents have not cited predecessors, past speeches, cited role models, aspirational past presidents to whom they look up and who they aspire to emulate. Donald Trump did none of that. There was no harking back to American history, to things where Trump would say, well, look back to so-and-so, and I hope to be cast in that mold. You didn't see any of that. It was not, for those who wanted this to be a unifying speech, it's fair to say that there were no harsh notes of division struck in the speech. No, he didn't lash out at anybody. I know that seems it's almost crazy to say that there was some chance that he might, but it's Donald Trump. So he did not lash out at anybody. He did not criticize anybody by name. He did not criticize Democrats. He didn't criticize his enemies. There was none of some of the paranoia that has sometimes come through in Trump's rhetoric. You didn't see that. So it was at least purged of those elements that we've heard in some Trump rhetoric in the past. And so in that respect, at least, it may be seen by some, especially by his fans, as having been an attempt at unity.
You see now the scattering, incredible collection and gathering of America's top politicians. They'll now scatter. The Obamas will leave Washington. They'll be taking that helicopter out of town to Andrews Air Force Base, and then the plane that President Obama has used, no longer designated Air Force One. The Obamas will head west for a much-deserved vacation. The Trumps now will head down Pennsylvania Avenue for the parade, the inaugural parade that they'll watch primarily from a viewing stand in front of the White House. And you saw the Clintons depart a little while ago. Not sure where they're headed, but obviously a very complicated day for them, a day of what might have been for Hillary Clinton and for her husband. Let's go back to Capitol Hill. Our colleague Mike McKee's still there. Mike, I'd love to get your thoughts on the speech and what it might do to lay the groundwork for any forward progress on either executive orders or legislation.
Well, if you think there were two audiences, Donald Trump was speaking to the 46% who voted for him. A lot of red meat, as you mentioned. It sounded like a campaign speech, but it also seemed like he was drawing a bit of a line in the sand for members of Congress. I'm going to propose the policies, you're not. He has now, on the White House website, laid out a series of policies on various issues that comport with what he put forward during the campaign. And he's talking about things like, in terms of trade, we're no longer going to to have unfair trade deals. I'm going to withdraw from TPP, and we're going to renegotiate NAFTA, and if countries don't, they will pay the price. He talks about the idea that we need to bring back manufacturing jobs through these tough but fair trade deals, and he talks about building the border wall. He is promising again on the White House website now that he is going to do that. So a lot of the campaign coming through immediately into Trump's governing plans. The question is how it's going to be received up here on Capitol Hill and how quickly he can get some of this stuff done and whether it will work.
Mike, we talked before about low-hanging fruit before the speech and talked a little bit about the possibility that one of the things that Donald Trump can do quickly to try to move the ball forward is to try to do some regulatory reform. Looking at this whitehouse.gov, these sets of policy statements, are there other things that you see there that you think could be translated into concrete action in the very early days of the administration?
There are a couple of things. He talks about eliminating regulations and focusing the EPA back on its mission of protecting clean air and clean water. So through executive action, he can kill some of the Obama-era regulations, get them back to work. One of the more interesting things on that website is his call for opening up federal lands for drilling for natural gas and oil. He has some power to do that. It will be violently opposed by people on the left side and on the environmental community, but he can do that. Whether that would accomplish what he wants is an open question, because at the same time he's talking about bringing back jobs to coal country. The two things sort of diametrically opposed, because if natural gas is more plentiful and cheaper, people don't want coal. He's got to figure out that balance. But it does look like he's going to go into energy as one of the first things he wants to do. The other interesting thing that came out in the speech doesn't show up as much on the White House website, but the idea that protection will bring prosperity. When he uttered that line, Wall Street seemed to have a heart attack and the stock markets went down. They don't want any kind of trade wars, but it sounds like he's embracing the idea as a possibility.
Certainly, the speech reflected in almost every respect the worldview of Steve Bannon, the former Breitbart executive and now a top White House advisor who clearly had a hand in crafting that message, and reflected the part of Donald Trump which is at odds on things like trade and industrial policy with the economic orthodoxy of the Republican Party. There you see the other side of the Capitol, the East Front, on what is a gray day in Washington. There's the helicopter that's waiting, parked there in front of the Capitol, waiting to take the Obama to Andrews Air Force Base. It is a gray day in Washington. Weather not particularly well. You saw a number of the attendees, including many of the women, wearing rain ponchos there during the proceedings. There's the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, and his wife, Jenna. Much will be made about the attendance at this event, lower than Barack Obama's inauguration 8 years ago. I'm sure Trump supporters, maybe Donald Trump himself, will point out that the weather probably kept some people away, as well as the intense security, perhaps the protesters. But this was certainly not the size crowd that Barack Obama had, and Donald Trump rarely likes to be second, particularly when it comes to crowd size. Let's bring back in our colleague Kevin Cirilli, also up on Capitol Hill. Kevin, would love to get your thoughts on how that speech will be received. Mike talked about the different audiences. How do you think that will be received by people who are opposed to Donald Trump? Did he give him any reason to give him a chance to those who didn't vote for him and aren't too pleased with his election?
No, I think the Democrats have done quite a successful job at defining Donald Trump, despite his efforts in this speech to reach out and unify, particularly on the issue of race. We did hear him 2 times during this speech argue that when you, in his own words, open your hearts to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. That clearly an effort on his behalf to, again, try to begin healing our very divided country right now. But more broadly speaking, I think that John hit this right on the head, in that this was really a speech that I think was perhaps a mixture of what we saw at his acceptance speech, accepting the nomination in Cleveland, but also a tad bit more of what we saw him in his acceptance speech in becoming the president-elect in New York at the Hilton on election night. And so it also had doses of the typical Trump campaign stump speech, ending, of course, with "Make America Great Again." One thing that I thought was missing and that I found found notable was that he didn't make a mention of the word wall. He talked about strengthening the borders, but a key part of what he said on the campaign trail, using that brash rhetoric, he left out in this speech. Though, as my colleague rightfully pointed out, it is on the website right now. Clearly right now, though, a lot of people parsing through that website, trying to figure out what exactly a Trump administration will begin to work on this weekend for lawmakers come Monday morning.
John, Kevin, two other things not mentioned in the speech, a bit of a surprise to some. One, didn't talk, as he did, of course, during the campaign, about the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and no mention of Hillary Clinton. Some nice words for the Obamas at the beginning of the speech, but no mention of Hillary Clinton, who was sitting right there. That's surprising some people, but he did reach out to his predecessor, Barack Obama.
Yeah, and the other thing I know. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say absolutely, and again, just particularly just watching the folks who were there, whether it's Hillary Clinton or the Obamas, just observing them. Clearly, a moment that many people did not expect. I can also tell you, though, that in terms of what you can expect the administration to begin focusing on, if you're a Democrat, you like talking about infrastructure spending. How exactly the Republicans will negotiate paying for that remains to be seen, and how Trump himself will begin negotiating with Democrats remains to be seen. But on the flip side of mere political optics, if you're a Democrat and you keep hearing about economic stimulus and government spending on infrastructure, you like what you hear a lot more than Tea Party conservatives when you listen to that speech.
We are looking there at the new president of the United States, Donald Trump, and his wife Melania, now standing with the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, and his wife Michelle, looking out over the mall here. We just saw Joe Biden and his wife get into a black car. They will be headed to Union Station, where they'll board a train, an Amtrak train, in the finest tradition of Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., and go back to Wilmington, Delaware, the family seat of the Bidens. Of course, Joe Biden having taken the Amtrak for years on a daily basis. He's returning home now on that same train. President Obama will be headed off soon by helicopter and then by plane out to Palm Springs, California later today.
By tradition, what happens is the outgoing president and vice president depart. The incoming president and vice president will join a lunch at the Capitol in Statuary Hall with members of Congress. And you see the President Trump now walking former President Obama to the helicopter. And this will be a parting of two men who have developed a bond of sorts during the transition, but who obviously have a history of negativity between them. And Barack Obama now faced with the reality of having, no matter how active or inactive he is as a former president, of watching his successor now try to undo much of what he accomplished in office, including, most importantly, probably on the Affordable Care Act.
Mark, I thought as we watched Donald Trump, we've commented now about the speech and its kind of dystopian description of America as it is today. Obviously, implicit in that is a certain kind of critique of Barack Obama. And I will say that watching the now former President Obama, watching him look on from the cutaway as Trump was describing America as he sees it now, there was a certain kind of, I would say, a slightly disapproving kind of stare that Barack Obama, not glowering, but Barack Obama clearly does not see the same America in 2016 that Donald Trump does. And hearing Trump describe America the way, as darkly as Trump did, you can't imagine that President Obama agrees with that assessment or that it rings very true to him, given all of the things that President Obama believes he has achieved and the incredibly optimistic way in which President Obama does talk about this country. Much more so than almost any Democrat today. He continues to have extraordinary faith in the country and continues to express a very bright vision of what we currently have today, not just what we will have tomorrow.
There is America's new political leaders, and the new First Lady, the new Vice Presidential wife, Karen Pence on the far end, Mike Pence, Melania Trump, and the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. The Obama era ends as the Obamas lift off and head out west for a vacation, although they'll be back in Washington before too long, where they're going to live for another year while their younger daughter finishes off high school. There's a Marine helicopter that'll take the Obamas to Andrews Air Force Base, a trip they've taken many times from the White House, not usually from the Capitol, a short helicopter ride away that takes them over to Andrews Air Force Base just outside Washington, D.C., where a government plane will fly them west. Again, no longer Air Force One, even though it is the plane the Obamas are very familiar with, that the president has flown around the country and the world on for many years. And Donald Trump will stay behind here at the Capitol. One of the great traditions of dining with the co-equal branch, the members of Congress will host the president and the vice president and their wives here at a lunch. That tradition that dates back to 1897. President McKinley began it, and they'll have a lunch of stuff that most Americans wouldn't eat or deign to eat: Maine lobster, Gulf shrimp, and saffron sauce and peanut crumble as the first course, and then some grilled Seven Hills Angus beef with dark chocolate and juniper juice and potato. A lunch that I'm not going to have, but it's the kind of lunch you have when you get to be president of the United States. There you see the Marine pilots who are going to take the president to Andrews Air Force Base and his wife. John, we talked to earlier about Trump's facial expression and tone. I thought he'd have a few moments of jocularity in the speech. He did not. No. He did in some of the greetings he made to folks. But this is a serious, so far, Donald Trump as into his presidency is a pretty serious-looking guy.
Well, and also, you know, one of the questions people had about this speech was whether there would be any extemporizing. I've looked now at the speech. We never did not see a version of the speech beforehand. All we have is a transcript of the speech. But if that transcript was prepared in advance in some sense, because it came out right after he spoke, it looks like he stuck pretty closely to the script. This was not it didn't feel like it as you listen to it, like he was going off script. He often does that. Even when he does prepared remarks, you hear him riffing. Not a lot of riffing in that speech, or any, as far as I can tell.
Historic moment here, one of the, I'd say, more historic shots we've seen of the day. The Marine helicopter lifting off carrying the 44th President of the United States, the first African-American President of the United States, first non-white President of the United States, out off the Capitol grounds as Donald Trump and Mike Pence watch the departure of Barack and Michelle Obama on a rainy day in Washington that is filled with history, filled with surprises, and the culmination of what we've never seen before: an American president, no military service record, no record in elective office. In fact, never had run for anything until he decided, after several years of considering it, to run for president of the United States. So Margaret Talev, our colleague who covered Barack Obama for many years, Michelle Obama and the campaign, I'd love you to just do a little analyzing of the body language and facial expressions of the Obamas here over the last hour as we watch Donald Trump be sworn in. Margaret Talev.
Mark, yes, the Obamas all morning have taken great pains to try to show support and calm for Donald Trump. But I think as you look across the Democratic Party at many of the stone-faced looks today throughout the crowd, there is some disconnect between his rhetoric in this speech about unity and his rhetoric over the entire course of the transition for a lot of Americans and the core of the Democratic Party. This is a matter of his words and his actions matching up now.
So, Margaret, I made a comment to Mark a few minutes ago about the fact that Barack Obama seemed to me to be looking on a little sternly as he listened to Donald Trump describe America as he sees it today in fairly dark dystopian terms. Do you agree with my kind of view that it would be hard for President Obama to hear the next president describing the America that he's inheriting in that way?
Well, certainly, Donald Trump painted a very grim tableau of rusted-out factories and drugs and crime and gangs. President Obama, when he came into office 8 years ago, not only came in on this theme of hope and change and spoke in a lot of optimistic terms, but also was inheriting this country in the midst of a financial collapse and spent the next several months bringing it back from the brink with help from members of both parties. So I think he certainly disagrees with Donald Trump's message and disagrees also strategically with the approach of attempting to unify people around a theme of doom and gloom. It's just none of it's the Obama way, and I think factually President Obama takes issue with kind of the tableau that Donald Trump has presented. It's true in many communities in America, but overall, across the United States, the trends in terms of economic recovery just don't match up entirely to the picture that the new president has painted.
There's a Marine helicopter headed to what is now Joint Base Andrews, no longer just the Air Force Base. I got that wrong before. And that's, of course, a familiar image to all Americans and certainly to the Obamas as they wing their way towards Andrews. The giant Air Force plane that used to be called Air Force One when Barack Obama flew on it, but now, as he heads west, he goes as a civilian, as a former president. Margaret, we talked before about his plans to stay active. Do we know how soon he'll be back in Washington, how long this vacation they plan is? Because my guess is, since he's left the door open to commenting, when he gets back, he may have comments.
Yeah, and although he is going to Palm Springs to play golf, get some sun and relax a little bit, they do have a life waiting back for them in Washington. Of course, their daughter Sasha is still in high school. And also President Obama is setting up a Washington office there in Foggy Bottom, in addition to his longer-term projects of the Library and Museum Foundation that are being set up in Chicago. There is an entire operation standing up in Washington now. We're beginning to see some of the contours of that. His two kind of closest body men, Trip Director Marvin Nicholson and Joe Paulson, staying on with him to manage his daily movements. Eric Schultz, the Deputy Press Secretary, is going to take on kind of a top strategist role. In addition to the communication staff, President Obama is standing up. So we will see the Obamas out and about in Washington, and potentially in the weeks and months to come hear from Barack Obama, although he has already said through his aides he's not planning on weighing in the Supreme Court nomination. That's between the new president and the Congress. But in terms of these other issues, whether it deals with human rights or even the press as an area he's signaled, or any of these sort of kind of ideological red lines that President Obama has drawn, he may very well engage.
Margaret, thank you for your wisdom always on President Obama. You're one of the smartest people we know talking about the 44th President of the United States. We're looking at the Statuary Hall where that luncheon, the traditional luncheon, is about to be held, the one that Mark described in such detail. Still thinking about juniper juice. Juniper Jew? I don't know exactly how you say that, but there's junipers involved in this lunch, and it's apparently going to be opulent and tasty. Mike McKee, you are up there on the Russell Rotunda. Give us a sense of where you think, to the extent that there are fault lines, and as Mark pointed out earlier, there are a lot of things that Donald Trump said in this speech that are, as he said during his campaign, that are far, far away from Republican orthodoxy. I've asked you a couple times where there's low-hanging fruit where Donald Trump might put points on the board, to mix metaphors, but quickly accomplish things. Well, let me ask you the opposite side of that question. As we look at congressional Republicans, Lindsey Graham having a picture taken by having a video, it looks like an interview he's doing there with Kelly O'Donnell from NBC News. Where do you think that significant fault lines on policy might emerge most quickly between members of the Republican caucus in the House and Senate and President Trump?
Well, obviously, tax reform is going to be the hardest thing for him to get through because his tax plans blow a big hole in the federal deficit. The right-leaning Tax Foundation says even under the best circumstances, if the tax reform generates more economic activity, it's $2.6 trillion in deficit spending over 10 years. And the Tea Party people aren't going to be happy about that. They're already pushing back on it. And it's hard to see how he does Obamacare, a complete repeal and replace with some of the plans that they have proposed without spending more money. So, and to meet his promise of covering everybody. So at this point, it's really a fault line over how much the government can spend to get things done. And we're going to have to see whether he can cobble together enough Republicans, because the Democratic attitude seems to be on all these things. You guys work it out first, and we'll decide what we're going to do later.
We've got our first tweets, Mike, from the new president. And, of course, much discussion about the fact that he plans to continue to tweet from his private Twitter account with its 20 million plus followers, now identified on his Twitter account as the 45th President of the United States. Today, we're not merely transferring power from one administration to another, Donald Trump tweets. or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to you, the American people. Hashtag Inauguration Day. Third tweet, what truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. So re-emphasizing, Mike, a populist message that no one could disagree with, but it's certainly not the emphasis you normally hear from Republicans.
Oh, definitely not. This was not the shining city on a hill that Ronald Reagan talked about. This was, as you mentioned, the dystopian view of America that plays very well in a lot of America that has suffered the Rust Belt, the coal country. But it is not the experience of a lot of people with the economy growing at 3.5% and unemployment at 4.7%, a marked contrast to when Barack Obama came into office. So it's going to be interesting to see whether he continues to aim his rhetoric and his policies at the smaller slice of America that hasn't done well, or whether he broadens it out to everybody. On his website, he says he can get 4% growth. That would be remarkable, economists say, and would depend on spending money to do things like raise productivity. It remains to be seen if he can do that, or is he going to just concentrate on some of the narrower slices of the economy that he's identified as problematic.
Mike, maybe the biggest thing, the biggest agenda item, and certainly the biggest ticket agenda item on Trump's mind and on that's advocated by people around him, including Steve Bannon and others, is the notion of $1 trillion infrastructure plan. That would be something that could have a significant effect in a variety of ways on the economy, not just in terms of its fiscal stimulative qualities, but in terms of actually building, putting in place infrastructure that could be the bedrock for the kind of productivity growth that you were talking about before. What kind of reception do you think that proposal is going to have in the months or days or weeks ahead whenever it comes to Capitol Hill? What do you think Republicans are going to say and do about the notion of that very, very large, very expensive item?
Well, it's not going to be large and expensive from Donald Trump's point of view, which may help Republicans embrace it because he doesn't want to spend $1 trillion. He wants private companies to spend $1 trillion. He'll give them tax credits, and they'll go out and identify projects, build them or rebuild them, and then charge the American people for using them and get the revenue stream to pay back their investment. A lot of people say that's not going to work very well, particularly on a large scale. Who's going to invest in a rural road in Indiana, Governor Pence, Vice President Pence, if they aren't going to get a lot of money for that? Democrats love the idea of infrastructure spending, but they want direct spending. They would like to see something like an infrastructure bank, which Barack Obama proposed and Republicans rejected. So at this point, the idea of doing more infrastructure spending is very well received on Capitol Hill by both parties, but how you do it and how you get there and how much the federal government actually spends, still very open questions with no good answers right now.
Mark Halpern and John Hammond with you. Mike McKee, our other colleagues from Bloomberg, covering Barack Obama's departure there. You see his helicopter landing at Joint Base Andrews outside Washington, D.C. for his switching from a helicopter to an airplane to leave Washington. A couple other things going on now. The new president, Donald Trump, has begun to tweet as president, reflecting and echoing many of the themes he talked about, particularly on the economy and the government in control of by the people. As part of his inaugural address, the president-elect is expected to sign some orders, or the president, rather, is expected to sign some orders. We don't know if he can sign orders and tweet at the same time, but at some point we're going to learn of some executive orders that he's supposed to do. That's a tradition that's been adhered to for a while, but they've been tight-lipped about exactly what kind of orders he would sign on this first day. He plans to save some signings for Monday. And then he'll attend a lunch. We've seen some scenes of that in Statuary Hall in the Capitol. There you see some members of Congress milling about, waiting for the president-elect, the president and the vice president. Got to get used to saying that as one of their first acts. So he'll tweet, he'll sign some orders, he'll come in there, and we're watching there in that smaller box the Marine helicopter that's taken the Obamas off the Capitol grounds and out to Andrews, where they are going to fly west to California, whereas Margaret Talbot said the president at least plans to spend some time in Palm Springs playing golf. John.
Mark, we're coming to the end here of our coverage, and as you see President Obama landing out there at Andrews, about to go off, I mean, you pull back and you're just struck every time we do this, where we have an outgoing president, incoming new president on Inauguration Day. Just the human element of this, it's something really beyond imagining for most people. This moment where by tradition, by ceremony, and by law. Some essentially, no matter who they are, no matter how famous or how rich, someone goes from being a civilian to controlling the most awesome military might of any country in the world, having extraordinary executive power over the economy, over the criminal justice system, over so much. And on the other side, someone who for the last 8 years, in Barack Obama's case, has enjoyed those prerogatives and that power, and now suddenly getting on a plane and becoming just another civilian. Not a remarkable civilian who've done extraordinary things, but just another guy like us. It's really struck by these moments that it is an amazing thing that happens on this day.
And the man who's assumed all those powers is about to enter this room. That's called the President's Room within the Capitol building. You see there the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. At the other end of the desk, Roy Blunt, the senator from Missouri, who's the administrator of the inaugural events, and some members of the new president's incoming cabinet. There you see Senator Dan Coates. In the darker tie, a former senator from Indiana who's been designated to be the head of national intelligence, and then former Texas Governor Rick Perry, who's been designated to run the Energy Department. This is the moment, if you don't count the tweets as Donald Trump's first official acts, and in this day and age, perhaps some of you will, but official acts where he's going to sign some orders. And again, some of these will be symbolic, but we're waiting to see exactly what topics are covered by these orders and whether any of them are substantive and newsmaking in a way that will certainly define the day. As we said, President Trump's inaugural address, not particularly newsmaking. And here you see the split screen in that smaller box, the Marine helicopter that the Obamas have flown out to join St. Andrews on. So we're watching symbolically here, pretty resonant, the outgoing president, departed President Barack Obama, the 44th president, leaving power, leaving office, and getting his last time fully within the bubble of the presidency. Out at Andrews, and in the other box, the larger box in the president's room in the Capitol, waiting for the new president, the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump, to come in and engage in some official activity. There's a lot of standing around on this day, including by members of Congress, because obviously the movements of the new president, the new vice president, are the things that will dictate the pace at which things go. Donald Trump, a little bit more like Barack Obama and George Bush, tending to stay more on schedule, not like the Clintons. In Bill Clinton's time in office, things ran far behind, including on the day of his inauguration. But you see there the milling about both in the president's room there in the Capitol, as well as we've seen several times within that lunch that the president and the vice president will attend. And then on the left, you see what we're expecting momentarily to see, Barack and Michelle Obama, having served 8 years. Here's President Obama, their final ride here out to Andrews Air Force Base at the end of his presidency.
There they are, President and the First Lady. As I said a moment ago, it is genuinely mind-boggling to try to put yourself in the minds of these people and what they are now going through. President Obama, someone who the journey that he went on at his age, young man, won the presidency against high odds, has now been president, has had successes, had failures, but has enjoyed the perks, prerogatives, power of the office, now essentially reduced to someone just like you and me, with obviously much more fame, much more standing, much more stature, but yet stripped as of this day of all of the awesome power that he just had hours ago, minutes ago. And Donald Trump, endowed with those powers in the same stroke of a pen. So it's an awesome day, and hard to fathom for anyone who is not standing in their shoes, which is basically all of us. Kevin Cirilli, tell us what you're hearing down there in Washington, D.C.
Well, you have a lot of lawmakers making their way back into the Capitol, obviously, talking with some of the offices and going back and forth with them. It's pretty partisan speech. You're hearing again from Democrats who are looking to already shape opposition. Look for people like Senator Chuck Schumer to really be the face of that opposition. But from a Republican standpoint, right now they are going to be giving Trump a chance, and they're going to see if he really can lead the entire Republican Republican Party, not just factions of the Republican Party, but really based off of what we saw today. I think Republicans are right now getting in line.
Kevin, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit and ask if you know anything about what orders we expect the new president to sign momentarily.
I can anticipate from what I've gathered, again, before the speech, leading up to the speech and the 24 hours before the speech, but we all know things are scheduled to change, that we can anticipate things on trade and health care. But quite honestly, there wasn't really a focus on health care in his address that we just heard, but I would anticipate the wording of these statements to be very, very carefully nuanced, because again, it's one thing to use and espouse this rhetoric on the campaign stump. It's an entirely different thing when you're governing. And so there are a lot of lawmakers who are behind the scenes who are actively working with the now current administration about the realities of governing, and on issues like immigration and health care in particular. He faces a new reality of governing and is at the mercy, quite frankly, of Congress.
We don't know how coordinated the two presidents are today and their staffs, but we are expecting Barack Obama to give some remarks here at Andrews before boarding the plane. This is another in a series of public statements from the outgoing president. He spent his last week of his presidency doing a lot to try to maybe define his legacy as well as influence the incoming president and to maybe squeeze the last drop, John, of the platform, which he had some ambivalence about as president. But we've seen this before as the time starts to dwindle, as the sands in the hourglass start to drift well to the bottom. We've seen presidents, Bill Clinton was like this, really racing at the end to get as much done as possible. There you see, I don't know if we can show you this, but I see in another monitor here the Clintons in Statuary Hall. There you see the Clintons as part of the assemblage waiting for the new president. Bill and Hillary Clinton invited to the lunch and plan apparently to attend.
Look, let's be clear about one thing. You know, Donald Trump is seen by many Democrats as a profound threat to many of their cherished values, policy priorities, and so on. And I think it's important to say that only in the context of what you were saying about President Obama. If you had asked, I think probably either of us, 6 months ago what we expected of Barack Obama's post-presidency, the last thing we would have said was that we expected Barack Obama to be an active figure in political life, that he would go off, write his memoir, possibly be more like George W. Bush than like Bill Clinton. You know, he's a young man, that he would have an active life, but not that he would be a big figure on the national stage in the short term. Donald Trump's election, I think, has changed the calculus for him. And for a lot of Democrats who are looking for a leader of a party that's been shattered in many ways, they are going to look to Barack Obama more than they look to Chuck Schumer or anyone else on the stage. And the most staggering thing about that is that Barack Obama, at least right now, from what we can tell, seems ready to accept that mantle.
Yeah, here is Barack Obama, and people will be watching these remarks closely for signals about the posture he plans to take. I don't think he'll show his full hand here regarding what kind of post-presidency he'll have, but this is an unusual event a little bit. Clearly part of this, I think, will be thanks. A big part of it will be thanks, including the folks out at Joint Base Andrews, a facility that has other functions but plays a huge part of any president's life because it is the arrival and departure point for all trips by plane, again, both domestic and foreign. And there you see the Obamas now as civilians at Andrews, and you don't need to know them particularly well to see there's a fair amount of emotion in both their faces as they recognize what they're leaving behind and what they're headed towards.
They stand there, Mark, important to note. You know, they stand there right now, two of the most popular figures in American life. Barack Obama's approval rating today is higher than it has been at any time in his presidency. He leaves at a peak in some respects, not just because of his performance, but perhaps in contrast to the bitterness and divisiveness of the campaign. Michelle Obama has had a woman who did not want any part of politics.
Again, Obama's with emotion on their faces,
Right.
and no escaping.
Right.
These are two folks who have been pretty poker-faced in public, even during hard times, during great times. In this, obviously, a lot going on. I don't remember seeing Barack Obama quite like this on more than a handful of occasions during his presidency. Same with the First Lady. And this is a moment, I think, to take the opportunity to remind everybody, as if they need to be reminded, this is the first African-American couple, the first non-white couple to serve as president and first lady, and that's not all they accomplished, to say the least, but it's an historic achievement.
Everybody.
Let's listen to the former president.
You know, Michelle and I, we've really been milking this goodbye thing. So it behooves me to be very brief. Yes. You know, I've said before, and I will say again, that when we started on this journey, we did so with an abiding faith in the American people and their ability, our ability, to join together and change the country in ways that would make life better for our kids and our grandkids. That change didn't happen from the top down, but it happened from the bottom up. It was met sometimes with skepticism and doubt. Some folks didn't think we could pull it off. There were those who felt that the institutions of power and privilege in this country were too deeply entrenched. And yet, all of you came together in small towns and big cities, a whole bunch of you really young, and you decided to believe. And you knocked on doors and you made phone calls and you talked to your parents who didn't know how to pronounce Barack Obama. And you got to know each other. And you went into communities that maybe you'd never even thought about visiting, and met people that on the surface seemed completely different than you, didn't look like you or talk like you or watch the same TV programs as you, and yet once you started talking to them, it turned out that you had something in common. And it grew and it built. And people took notice. And throughout, it was infused with a sense of hope. And as I said in 2004, it wasn't blind optimism that drove you to do all this work. It wasn't naivete. It wasn't willful ignorance to all the challenges that America faces. It was hope in the face of difficulty, hope in the face of uncertainty. You proved the power of hope. And throughout this process, Michelle and I, we've just been your front men and women. We have been the face, sometimes the voice, out front on the TV screen or in front of the microphone, but this has never been about us. It has always been about you. And all the amazing things that happened over these last 10 years are really just a testament to you. In the same way that when we talk about our amazing military and our men and women in uniform, the military is not a thing. It's a group of committed patriots willing to sacrifice everything on our behalf. It works only because of the people in it. As cool as the hardware is, and we got cool hardware, as cool as the machines and weapons and satellites are. Ultimately, it comes down to remarkable people. Some of them a lot closer to Malia's age than mine or Michelle's. Well, the same thing's true for our democracy. Our democracy is not the buildings. It's not the monuments. It's you being willing to work to make things better and being willing to listen to each other and argue with each other and come together and knock on doors and make phone calls and treat people with respect. And that doesn't end. This is just a little pit stop. This is not a period, this is a comma in the continuing story of building America. So to all of you that have put your heart and soul not just into our campaigns, but into making schools better, making sure our veterans got the care they needed, making sure that we left behind a planet that is safe and secure for our kids, making sure that hardworking people had a ladder of opportunity and could support families. For all of you who have just done amazing, remarkable work, most of it unheralded, most of it without fanfare, most of it without you getting any word of thanks, we could not be proud of you. I could not be proud of you. This has been the privilege of my life, and I know I speak for Michelle as well. And we look forward to continuing this journey with all of you. And I can't wait to see what you do next. And I promise you I'll be right there with you. All right? God bless you. Thank you, everybody. Yes, we did. Yes, we can.
Brief remarks from Barack Obama after first public remarks after leaving office. And there you see on the right side, Donald Trump in his first official acts as president was signing waivers to allow his choice for Defense Secretary General Mattis to serve as Defense Secretary. It's a waiver to a law that precludes anyone from the retired military service shortly after they leave office from serving in a civilian role at the Pentagon, but Mattis is getting a waiver, and this is something that is supported by many Democrats in Congress who have given Mattis as much acclaim as anyone who Donald Trump has picked to serve with him in the new government, trying to find out if he's signing other orders as well. And there you see a tableau you should get used to, which is Donald Trump surrounded by his family here, a mixture you saw when the shot was widened out of top government officials, including the Speaker of the House there, Paul Ryan, over Donald Trump's shoulder. There's Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic leader in the House, but then behind Donald Trump, his family members and small children you see wandering around, Trump grandchildren, as well as the young man next to Speaker of the House, Barron Trump, the president's youngest child. And this is, as I say, John, going to be, I think, a pretty familiar sight of Trump children and grandchildren as part of his life.
They are a close-knit family, and Donald Trump has made it really clear that that in many cases that they are going to play really important roles in this administration. As you say, a sight that presidents' families are always important, always the subject to a lot of analysis and a lot of interest. But this is going to be a little different in the sense that they are going to, some of those members, particularly Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner, are going to be very active members of this administration, very important advisors to President Trump. We will, as you say, we'll be seeing this tableau or something like it quite a lot over the next 4 years at least.
Another of the things the president is signing is a proclamation declaring this a day of patriotism. That is, of course, a big theme for any president, but one that Donald Trump emphasized in his inaugural address and talks about quite a bit. And in addition to these proclamations and orders, Donald Trump, of course, as we mentioned before, tweeting from his personal account, not from his new government account, the new presidential account, but from his personal account, a number of remarks from resonating and reflecting what he said in his inaugural address. So, John, as we said, he'll sign some orders, he'll head to lunch, and then the inaugural parade, and then some inaugural balls tonight. Your final thoughts here as we conclude this part of our coverage today here on Bloomberg Television.
Because Inauguration Day is a day so steeped in tradition and ritual, it tends to take even someone as unusual a figure as Donald Trump and make him look kind of like all the other presidents. This is what every president has done. One of the questions that we have going forward is to what extent Donald Trump will conform to the office, to what extent will the office shape him, make him not ordinary, but put him more in keeping with what we expect from a president? In what ways will he bridle against those traditions and mores and norms and constraints? So much of his political success has been based in his uniqueness and in the ways in which he was not traditional and was unusual. It will be an interesting balancing act because Americans want him to be sort of presidential as conventionally conceived. On the other hand, if he becomes too much like every other president and too conventional, he'll lose some of the political potency that brought him to where he is now. So it's going to be an interesting thing to see how he manages that balancing act going forward.
It has been a day of conventions, as John said. This has looked like other inaugurals in almost every respect. The tweets is something that is different, and of course something there's no doubt Donald Trump will continue, but he will go on throughout this day being somewhat constrained by the schedule that other presidents have kept. Fewer inaugural balls than most other presidents have had, but for the most part, today will be a normal first day of a presidency, first half day, and then he has sent signals that the weekend will be somewhat of a down period. Monday is when I think we'll begin to see in earnest what this administration, which promises explicitly to be different from what others have done, we see that starting to play out. John and I thank you for watching Bloomberg Politics live coverage of Donald Trump's inauguration. We'll be back here in this studio, 5 Eastern time, for a final encore episode of our program with all due respect. Until then, Bloomberg TV coverage of this historic day will continue. For our colleagues, for John, we say thank you. Bloomberg will continue after this quick break.
Do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will, to the best of my ability.
And will, to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.